Welcome to today's webinar, The Ultimate Guide to Understanding Pollen Data. My name is Ronit Margulies, and I'm the Digital Marketing Manager here at Brizometer and your moderator. I wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Today's session will be recorded and emailed afterwards. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. To ask a question, please use the Q&A panel that can be found when you click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. On today's agenda, why the effects of pollen exposure can no longer be ignored, or in other words, why we need to pay attention to pollen. The ABCs of pollen: seasons, pollen regions, types, and species. Environmental elements that affect dispersion and exposure. The complexities, measurements, and limitations. How to handle the complexities of pollen, including how Brizometer is optimizing its algorithmic solution for pollen. And lastly, how pollen data benefits your business and products via our use cases. Lastly, we will have the Q&A session when we finish the webinar. Feel free to send us your questions. We want to hear from you. And if we don't get to answer them by the end of the webinar, someone will follow up with you after. Today's webinar will be hosted by Dr. Amir Pastor. Amir is an expert in algorithms, mathematical modeling, and statistics. He holds a PhD from the School of Mechanical Engineering at Tel Aviv University, was a senior lecturer and also the head of the Environmental Hydrology Lab at the university. His research was focused on the development of numerical models for transport of contaminants in groundwater. Amir is our environmental modeling specialist here at Brizometer, where he leads the ongoing development of our pollen forecasting models. We also have the pleasure of being hosted today by Amit Safir. Amit is the Partnerships Manager at Brizometer. Amit has over a decade of experience working in Israeli health tech, both in healthcare systems and medical devices. In the past, Amit has built business cases for powerful technologies used for cancer screening and diagnostics at UC Care and Mobile ODT, bringing products from ideas to reality and then commercializing them in multiple markets. Amit is a biomedical engineer and holds an MBA from the Technion. I'll pass it over to you, Amit.
Thank you, Ronit. Amir, pleasure co-hosting this webinar with you. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. As some of you guys who joined our previous webinars may know, Brizometer is on a mission to improve the health and quality of life of billions of people worldwide. We're doing this by providing businesses, cities, authorities, and individuals the most accurate and actionable environmental data. We offer a range of products that include environmental data from air quality to pollen, weather information, and fire incidents data. Similar to what we do with air quality data, our pollen data includes innovative features such as real-time location-based data, a universal pollen index, colorful, beautiful heat maps, a 3-day forecast. Global coverage today includes US, Japan, and Europe. And what's most important is that all of our data is broken down into pollen types and species. So, why is pollen data important? Pollen data is a problem that can no longer be ignored. It's costing millions of dollars worldwide to allergy patients. About 50 million people alone in the US struggle with allergies, and it's costing the US economy $18 billion a year. This is just on allergy medications to control the symptoms caused by pollen. Allergic pollen is the most important and most frequent trigger for allergic diseases. It has effects and symptoms such as itchy, watery eyes, runny nose, itchy throat, just to mention a few of them. And to make things even worse, when combined with air pollution, the effects are even more critical. By the damage, we've seen that by the damage that we humans are doing to the planet Earth, climate change has a strong effect on pollen. The higher CO2 level concentrations are, the higher pollen counts have been detected. This is found in multiple scientific studies. So now we know that your customers that suffer from pollen sensitivity are concerned. Their allergies are becoming central to everyday conversation. And this is why it's crucial for you to understand pollen. And this is why we have here Emil, who will take it from here and tell us a little bit more about pollen.
Thank you so much, Amit and Renit, for this introduction. We know, most of you probably know what pollen is, but just to make sure that we're all starting on the same page, let's get a quick definition going. Pollen is a fine powdery substance. It's typically yellow and consisting of microscopic grains discharged from the male part of a flower. Pollen is similar in some ways to other air pollutants. It is a particulate matter by definition. However, pollen is a biological component, as opposed to these other air pollutants, which are either a byproduct of combustion processes like indoor heating, wildfires, power plants, and traffic emissions, or mechanical processes such as mineral dust. Air pollutants have a wide spectrum of sizes. As we see here in this figure, on the extreme side, we have gaseous contaminants, which are molecules and are therefore extremely small. And on the other extreme, we have heavy dust, which can be as large as 1,000 microns, that is 1 millimeter. Pollen falls somewhere in between. The size of pollen particles is bigger than most of the main pollutants that affect human health. So they are not small enough to get into the bloodstream, but small enough to enter our airways and act as an irritant that can set off a chain of allergic and asthmatic reactions, as Amit just mentioned. Pollen is part of the plant's reproductive system. Each pollen grain contains a male gamete that can fertilize the female ovule. The pollen grains are transported by the wind or by insects and other animals. Here's a cool fact. Pollen can also be transported by water, but this is actually pretty rare. Contrary to the popular belief, pollen is not produced just by flowering plants. It is produced by most plants with seeds. And when you see a beautiful flower, usually the pollen is transported from this flower to another flower by insects, which are attracted to the smell, shape, the color, and the nectar of the flower. Typically, plant species that emit pollen that is considered to have an adverse effect on the general population are actually the ones with no color or smell, and they don't need to attract any insects. These plants just need to spread their pollen into the wind for efficient pollination. This is portrayed in these pictures here. On the left, we see a pine cone that spreads pollen into the wind and therefore needs to disperse significant amount of grains. And on the right, we see the tiny amounts of pollen needed when pollination is done by a bee that is attracted to the flower and its nectar. And speaking of efficient pollination, because distribution by wind is not targeted, plants need to produce huge amounts of pollen. And as you can see in this beautiful video, we are talking about huge amounts of grains. For each tree, this can be as much as billions of pollen grains. The plants that emit pollen are divided into 3 groups: grass, weeds, and trees. These groups, each one of them contains thousands of types. The specific chart we see here is an example provided by an allergy group in Nevada, just to give you an idea of the important species that exist in these groups there. And of course, this type of list would vary by region and by climate zone. Now that we have covered the basics, in order to fully understand the complicated nature of forecasting pollen levels, we must take a look at the different environmental elements which affect the emission behavior of pollen. This is where things start to get complicated. So let's talk a bit about pollen seasons, or when is pollen produced? This is a simplistic question with a complex answer. Let me explain. So take a look at this pollen calendar provided here for Seattle. The specific location is irrelevant here. We just wanted you to understand that each species has a specific time period for emission. And typically, the trees are the first to produce pollen at the start of spring. The trees are followed by grasses throughout summer. And lastly, closer to fall, we have weeds. This is generally true in Europe and in North America, and it's also generally true in the southern part of Australia. The exact timings in specific location is highly dependent on the local climate and on the local weather patterns. So what you see in this type of calendars does not necessarily depict the precise timings of emissions in your location. Rather, it is showing the approximate span of time where pollen is likely to be emitted by the given plant. And to complicate things even further, the seasons change over time due to climate change, as we see in this figure, where we see how rapid pollen season has changed over the past 20 years in the central region of the United States. All of these variations have to be correctly taken into account in pollen models in order to render them useful for the allergy sufferer. So, when talking about pollen seasons, there is actually a scale effect in the works. Let me explain. If you were to look at a single tree, you would observe an emission period of a few weeks, sometimes spanning just down to 1 or 2 weeks. But if you were to zoom out on an area which has multiple trees, you would observe large periods of emission, as each tree experiences a different microclimate. This results in an effect where a region will have an emissions period that is longer than any individual tree's emission periods. In order to be transported by the wind, the pollen grains have to be dried up so that they get disconnected from the flowers. So weather plays a large part in the process. When you have a warm, windy day, you have perfect conditions for pollen. In contrast, when humidity gets high, pollen is not emitted. This is precisely what you see in this figure here, where you can see the clear correlation between high relative humidity and low pollen levels. In addition, if it is raining, the rain will physically remove the pollen grains from the air. Interestingly, it can be the same amount of rain, but removal is more efficient with smaller drops versus larger drops. The important takeaway here is that you must take into account the weather conditions when you are predicting the pollen levels. So we have seen how complex the problem is. So how are pollen concentrations actually being measured today? What exists today in terms of pollen measurements is that in most measurement stations, there is a mechanical apparatus which either rotates or stands still. This is covered with a sticky substance which the pollen grains stick to. And once in a few days or once a week, the slide is removed and taken to a microscope, and the pollen is counted under the microscope. The count process is done by experts who know how to recognize different types. Next, the density of the pollen grains on the slide is translated by an empirical formula to air concentration levels. Basically, we move from how much sticks to how much is in the air. The takeaway here is that this process is limited by operator expertise, that it is not real-time, nor it is continuous, especially on the weekends. So the measurement is typically reported with a delay. This delay can be as long as a couple of weeks. Apart from all these issues, there's also a huge issue of data availability. Data is usually not available to the public. This is in contrast with air pollutants, which are typically measured by government stations, and their data is open to the public use. Here, when we consider pollen, most of the stations are privately owned. Another issue, the measurements are affected by local conditions, so we must be careful when making conclusions from the station data about the surrounding locations, which are not in the immediate vicinity of the station. Measurements alone do not guarantee the capability to forecast pollen data. Another issue that we have is the amount of data, and it is limited, simply because the number of active stations is about 1,000. While this might seem like a large number, as you can see in this image, there are large areas in the world that are sparsely covered by stations. Therefore, it is an extremely complicated task to provide global pollen coverage. So, Amit is going to take over and explain how we are handling this complex modeling issue for pollen, or in other words, how can an organization provide full coverage for an affected region with such a limited set of data points coming from the stations?
Thank you, Amit. That was very insightful. So precisely that complexity is what Brisometer is coming to improve on what currently exists out there. We take into account phenological factors, vegetation land cover, weather, in addition to yearly production factor. And all of these data combined with measuring stations, we're able to provide the data coverage that we commit to. Add to that monitoring stations and different regional labels, include all that into our algorithms, and that's how we populate our current pollen API and heat maps. To give you a visual understanding of the importance of adding meteorological data into the model, take a look at these two figures that Amir's team provided. We show here the index of oak pollen for a specific day in last year. Note the difference between both figures. It's clear that adding meteorological data changes the pollen forecast quite considerably, and it makes it much more defined and accurate. So I would like to move on and talk a little bit about some of the use cases that our partners are currently developing for our data. ALK is a pharmaceutical company from Denmark that, through their product Clara, they are able to provide actionable insight, which helps patients mitigate their exposure to air pollution and pollen. They help advise their users when to take even the most simple smart actions that can be significant. For example, if the air pollution and pollen levels are low, and sensitive users can know that it's okay to be outdoors and to have any type of outdoor activity, that can really help their customers. Without this information, this demographic might be mistakenly exposing themselves to dangerous conditions, or equally unfortunate, they cannot allow themselves to enjoy some outdoor activities in fear of exposure to pollution and pollen. ALK actually is a great use case because they combine weather, air pollution, and pollen, and they are able to provide a 360-degree impact. Other customers of ours are using our data to make sure that their customers are following up on their medication usage. They know when their customers should be taking their medication and their inhaler, and they're able to notify them. They identify personal triggers, and they track overall exposure of their customers. Some other use cases include marketing data, for example. Some companies are empowering their marketers to localize those who are affected by pollen in these regions where pollen counts are high. Pharmaceutical companies are using our data today as inputs into their clinical trials, and there's a variety of AI assistant tools that today can provide insights about pollen counts. So, Ronit, Amir, let's round this up. What can we do with pollen data? We can show our customers the pollen levels are expected to be high. We can notify them when they might be exposed to a risky pollen levels. We can see pollen levels rising in a map. We can increase their engagement by giving them real-time data, and that can truly improve their lives. Similar to what we do with air quality data, we have innovative features that are today available. We can provide current conditions and with up to 10 different pollen species. We have 3-day forecasts available. We have pollen heat maps with beautiful color-coded notifications, all divided per species. And we provide location-based details at a very, very high resolution. We're talking not just per city, but per neighborhood. Ronit, do we have time for questions?
Thanks, Amit. I believe that we do have some time for questions. And we had some coming in while the webinar was going on. Here's one that I think you could take, Amit. What's your coverage here at Brisometer?
Yeah. Today, our coverage is in the United States, Japan, and Europe. But we're currently working for global coverage. With our current coverage, we have about 2.75 billion people covered. That's a third of the world population. We're working really fast and really hard to cover the entire globe.
Amazing. Thanks, Amit. I'm going to take another one here that I think also would be a good one for you to field, Amit. What is the Brisometer index based upon?
So it's a bit complex. Our index is based on the levels that we forecast and thresholds that are not set by us, but they're set by epidemiological studies. It's very complicated because it only shows an average, but the individual feels the symptoms different at the beginning of the season than at the end. It's usually stronger at the beginning of the season than at the end. I hope that provided an answer to that.
Thanks, Amit. I think that we are going to take another one here. And this one, I'm going to give over to you, Amir. How much time can we do forecast ahead?
Okay, so currently we provide a forecast of 3 days. And in principle, we could provide more than 3 days because we could use weather forecasts which are up to 1 week or more. However, the issue is that accuracy of such weather forecasts to more than 3 days is generally reduced. Weather data is less accurate when you talk of these long-term periods so far in the future. So since our team is fanatic about our accuracy, we prefer to give just a 3-day forecast of pollen.
Thanks, Amir. Since we have some more time, we're going to field some more of the questions from you guys. Thanks for sending them in. Having access to your API, can I create an Android app in Poland in Europe that shows precisely what part of the city is affected by pollen? Pollen. Who wants to take this one?
Absolutely. I'll be happy to take that. Yeah, the question is yes, absolutely. Today, with our API, you can build an Android, an iOS app, web app, and you can get to accuracy levels that are on the neighborhood resolution. So yeah, that is absolutely correct.
Thanks, Amit. I have another question here. Do you guys have coverage in China?
Amir, you want to take that one?
Yes, we do. I believe we didn't mention that, but that number that Amit mentioned, the 2.75 billion people that are covered are including this population in China. China is covered.
Great. Thanks, Amir and Amit. I think we're gonna wrap it up. And I just wanted to take this time to thank both Amit and Amir for being with us today and providing their expertise and knowledge into pollen and pollen data. We really appreciate it. I want to thank you guys for joining us today on this pollen data webinar. Pay attention to your email inboxes. For the next upcoming webinar, we will be having them about once a month, and we would be happy to see you there. If you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to visit the site, brisometer.com, and send us any questions you have at info@brisometer.com. And as always, you can follow us on our social channels. Here you have Twitter @brisometer. Thank you again, and I hope you guys have a great day.